Thanks, Sarah. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you here, whether you're joining in your early morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you for being here with us. We're going to be using the chat today for our question and answers, and we've built time in for that. So please be sure to put your questions in the chat box. For those that will be needing translations, we're using Wordly, as you know, we use it every time. Sarah's put the link in the chat, and so please click on that to access Wordly. And if you're having problems with that, then please just send a message to Sarah and she'll be sure to help you out. So again, welcome. We're so excited that you're joining us for our fourth and final webinar in our series of developing equitable markets for menstrual health supplies. We hope you've learned as much as we have, and we're excited that through these series, we've been able to launch a range of new resources from toolkits to advocacy messages and everything all based on evidence aimed to help us strengthen our global menstrual markets. And the work has been prioritized from the menstrual health work stream. And we want to really give a special thank you to our RHSC donors, especially the Sanitation Hygiene Fund, for their support of this particular project. And as you know from joining us and the advertisements we've put out, that today's webinar is going to focus on tax policies and helping us better understand how tax policies shape prices. You know, one thing to date we know as a menstrual health community, we've had success in advocating for the so-called period tax to have it removed. And we want to acknowledge that these victories matter and that they're important and we should celebrate them. But at the same time, we've noticed that these wins have raised some important questions for us. If we're removing the taxes on menstrual products, then why haven't we seen meaningful improvements in affordability? Why are these savings not always being passed down to the consumers? And why aren't they always equitable? Why aren't those benefits happening equally to everyone? And so we felt as a work stream, we really wanted to better understand that gap. And that's what led us to this important work. And so today's discussion is we're going to explore what's been happening in practice to review lessons learned from India and Kenya, where they've had success in removing that. And we'll hear from manufacturers' perspectives on how has this impacted their work. And it's really an opportunity to look at and identify opportunities to ensure that when we use these tax policies, that they result in the change that we're hoping, right? That there's equitable benefits for the people that we're hoping to reach, and that we really do see prices being reduced for the consumers. So today we're excited to share the findings of this work, release some new tools that you can use in our advocacy work. And there's also going to be some really good recommendations that we can use to really take into our day-to-day advocacy work that will be tangible and meaningful. And help us move forward with action collectively. One of the things I want to say is sometimes you might think about this tax policy, it can seem overwhelming and complex, but we've had the chance to hear from many people on this team, and they have been able to take this complex issue and put it together in a digestible way for us. So we're really excited to hear from them and learn how we can improve and do better. So with that, we're excited to turn the time over to Chris Jones, who will take us to the next step. Thank you. Thank you, Chris, and over to you.
Thanks, Diana. That's a great setup for the work that we've been really supporting over the last 18 months in partnership with RHSC. So great setup, great also explanation of our aims and objectives of trying to begin to simplify what is really a pretty complicated issue, especially when you get deep into it, and translate it into terms that advocates and NGOs and manufacturers and associations can understand. So that's what we're all about. It's great to be here and finally sharing this work over those last 18 months that we've been supporting it. So today we've got a really full hour planned. I'll be starting by introducing the work and some of the key concepts that underpinned it and the major findings that emerged. My colleagues Rita Mwachandi and Tanya Mahajam, sorry, Tanya, will bring these concepts to life by sharing what we've learned from applying the model in Kenya and India. We're also fortunate to be joined by three market actors who navigate these issues every day. That's Davies Mosami of the Kenya Manufacturers Association, JD Mandal of Askar Innovations in India, and Esther Njoroge of LilyCup, who will share their perspectives on how tax policy plays out in practice. As of last week, all of the materials described in this webinar, including the full report and the simulation tool, and supportive documentation are available on the RHSC website, so yay. And let's dive in. Okay, so this partnership with RHSC aimed to understand what happens when governments reduce or remove taxes on menstrual health products, as Diana outlined. The product policy simulation and equity tool is a core output of this work, and it models how taxes and other costs move through the value chain and affect retail prices for the end consumer. Our hope is that this work will provide advocates and policymakers, NGOs and manufacturers, and national programs governments with practical evidence and tools to advocate for smart tax and regulatory reforms that have positive impacts for consumers and sustainable menstrual health markets. So the simulation tool sits at the center of our work. It helps estimate how changes in taxes, duties, fees, and other policies may affect prices, affordability, and equity. And at a high level, it follows the pathway shown on the right, from understanding tax policy to costs that build into the value chain, to prices, and ultimately to affordability and equity outcomes. The tool was designed to test different policy scenarios and estimate how those changes may affect consumers in different income groups, as well as government revenues, who are also balancing these trade-offs. And importantly, they are modeled scenarios. They are not predictions. So markets, just to be clear, are messy and complex, and data is challenging to gather. So because of that, the qualitative analysis as part of this work, as well as the work that you're supporting in each one of your countries, is every bit as important to understand not just what might happen in markets, but why. So first, a few concepts. The graphic that we're looking at now includes the value chain and outlines how costs build as products are manufactured and imported and distributed and sold into the shops that get menstrual health products into the hands of consumers. As Rita and Tanya will share, the value chain looks really different for local importers than it does for domestic manufacturers, and that has an important implication in our key findings. Pass-through is a term you'll hear a lot from us. It is simply the share of cost savings that ultimately reaches consumers through lower prices. So when taxes or other costs are reduced by national programs or governments through policy, not all of those savings are passed on to consumers. Some are retained at different points in the value chain. And we'll talk a bit more about why that is. So if pass-through is the share of savings that reaches consumers, the obvious question is, so what determines how much actually gets through to the menstruator? Our analysis indicates that there are several factors at play. First is market structure, how competitive a market is, and how products move through the value chain. So for example, informal markets, which tend to be fragmented and working efficiently. So think of sub-wholesalers selling into an unregistered shop that serve a village. They're also more likely to hold on to savings generated from tax savings. And those fragmented informal markets are also more likely to be serving rural, lower income people as well. Second is administrative efficiency from the government. Tax policy on paper and tax policy in practice are not always the same thing. And Rita's going to highlight how this case played out in her presentation of the Kenya case study. And third is market behavior. Actors don't always drop prices immediately or proportionately when costs change, especially in the informal market structure. And finally, HS codes and product classification, which we've heard a lot at during these series, they can determine whether products actually qualify for favorable tax treatment in the first place. And Rita and Tanya will come back to each one of these themes later on in this hour. But the key point is that tax reform alone does not determine outcomes. How markets function and how policy is implemented are equally important. So I'm not going to spend much time on the mechanics of VAT, other than to say it's quite simple to understand at a high level, but it gets really complicated quite quickly. So read the full report for more detail. But the key point here is that VAT can be structured in different ways, and those different structures create very different outcomes for manufacturers and importers and consumers. The bottom of the slide highlights how VAT can be structured or rated in different ways. Standard rating and exemption and zero rating are the most common, and each have a big impact on both actors in the value chain and the end consumer. So let's get into our key findings and what we learned. Just to reiterate, and this is an important point that Diana made earlier, tax reform is absolutely valuable. It's really important. It can lower production and import and distribution costs. And so it's important not to lose sight of that. Favorable tax policy is a good thing for many reasons. And a big but, not all that policy translates to cost reductions reaching consumers, and some policies have uneven impact on different players. In practice, our analysis suggests that only about half of savings translate into lower retail prices to the consumer, to the menstruator. So while tax reform is necessary, it is rarely enough on its own to ensure affordability for the lowest income consumers. So why then do those reforms fall short? So first, pass-through is incomplete, as I said. Even when policy successfully lowers costs for manufacturers or importers or upstream distributors, not all of those savings all the time reach consumers. Some are retained at different points in the value chain. Second, market structure matters a lot, which explains that first bullet that I just described. We found that factors such as competition and the role of informal markets and the effectiveness of tax administration can significantly influence how much benefit reaches the menstruator. In some cases, these factors can dilute the impact of otherwise well-designed reforms. And third, VAT design matters a lot. This is the biggest takeaway from our work. Policies that appear favorable on paper can create unintended consequences in practice. And in particular, VAT exemption can embed costs in production and disproportionately impact domestic manufacturers or small and medium-sized enterprises and innovators. So the result is that favorable tax policy often delivers meaningful benefits, but those benefits are smaller than expected, unevenly distributed across different market actors, and they frequently are insufficient to close the affordability gaps for lowest income consumers and menstruators. So the Kenya and India case studies really bring out each of these findings to life and illustrate how different market contexts can produce very different outcomes from similar policy objectives. So I'm going to hand it off to Rita now, who's going to present what we learned in Kenya and paint a fuller picture of this, and also speak with a representative from the Kenya Manufacturers Association to give us a better insight into what's actually going on here. Over to you, Rita.
Thanks, Chris. Kindly confirm that you can hear me.
Gotcha.
Great. Thanks, and good afternoon to everyone. Like Chris said, my name is Rita Mwachandi, an associate of Man Global Health, working from Nairobi, Kenya. And this afternoon, morning for some of you, I'll be bringing to life some of the concepts that Chris has spoken into using Kenya as a case study. Next slide, please. I think a good place for us to begin would be to appreciate that Kenya has made very progressive tax reforms over the years, with an aim to expand access and improve affordability for menstrual hygiene products. And we have seen a lot of very good reforms right from the beginning in 2004, where we saw VAT exemptions on finished products. And then much later, we saw import duty removed on finished products. And in 2026, we saw the same reforms rolled over to raw materials with the aim of improving and encouraging local production. And then very recently, we've seen very good program reforms, such as the free pad distribution for schools. And I think really the question that lingers for many is, have all these progressive reforms contributed to a price reduction for consumers on the shelf? And the answer is yes and no. So yes, in the earlier years, we do want to acknowledge that we saw a price reduction, and that was 2004, and that was largely driven by Procter & Gamble, who were the market leaders at the time with their Always brand. and because they were very intricately involved in the reform negotiations. When the reforms were finally passed, they passed on a considerable large amount of the cost savings to the consumers. And because they had 80% of market share with their Always brand, we saw all the other smaller brands anchoring their costs around P&G, and there was really a notable reduction in terms of pricing for menstrual hygiene products. And what P&G said to us when we spoke to them, what they wanted to do at the time was to expand the category, so bring in more women to start using made-for-purpose product, which was not the case at that time, and that largely succeeded. But unfortunately, we did not see that affordability sustained over time. And sadly, as we speak right now, we have noted or we have observed some affordability gaps in the market. And from the next slide, we will begin to see why. Next slide, please. So from our observations, we noted several factors that have contributed to the fact that we've not been able to see the very good policy intent translating into sustained price reduction. And one of the areas, as Chris had mentioned, is what we are calling the stack VAT, which is brought about by the VAT tax exemption policy for menstrual hygiene pads. And this ensures that there's no VAT that is charged to the consumer at the retail point. But however, this policy was well intentioned, but it's created some distortions in the market. And the two players in the market, so the importers and the domestic manufacturers, have the same policy, but have both have very different takeouts of how the policy plays out from their end. The illustration below shows us how each of the players experiences the VAT exemption policy design. If you look to your left, we will see that for importers, we have a very clean, simple pathway where the product comes in and it's VAT exempt right from the port of entry and goes down through the distribution chain fairly easily, with little or no VAT charged across the distribution chain. And so by the time it gets to the consumers, they are not cost embedded, and the importer needs not to go through the process of applying for VAT reimbursement. However, the same policy plays out very differently for domestic manufacturers. And what we see is that there's what we are calling the stack VAT that disproportionately affects the domestic manufacturer and increases cost for them. So at the point where the product is coming in at the port of entry, unfortunately, even if on paper it's stated that everything is VAT exempt, there are some raw materials that are still subject to VAT, and we'll be hearing more about that from our guest speaker, Davies. And then when we go down to manufacturing, there are other cost pressures that also come to bear layer for local manufacturers, things like electricity. Electricity is quite expensive in Kenya, and it has got a VAT that is levied on it. And so all these VAT and other taxes and other para tariffs that are stacking up on the product find their way to the end product, because there's no way for the local manufacturer to be able to claim some of this VAT because their final product is VAT exempt. Next slide, please. And over and above the stack VAT, we also observe that there are other realities in the market that do contribute to the point where policy intent has not translated into sustained price reduction. And we saw that there are other structural barriers, and we classified these structural barriers under three core areas. One was around the policy design. We've spoken about the VAT exemption, but we also have something else that is called duty remission. And duty remission really is a process that unlocks import duty for local manufacturers. Importers need not go through it because at the point of entry, this is already taken care of. But for importers, they have to go through this process. It's an administratively heavy process. It's tedious and it's costly. And what we found and what we observed is that SMEs are not able to navigate this process, and they give up on it altogether, and they layer any costs that are associated with duty remission onto the end user. Then we also looked at the market structure, and Chris spoke about the market structure and how it can influence affordability. What we found for ourselves in Kenya is that our market is very fragmented. We have a lot of our sales, I think 80% of our menstrual hygiene product sales are going through the informal distribution channel. And this channel has got multiple intermediaries, sometimes as many as 5, from the point where the product leaves the product leaves the factory gate to the point where the consumer gets the product at the retail outlet. We have about 5 intermediaries, and on each of these layers, unfortunately, there is a profit margin that is being added by each intermediary. And what we observe is that at some point, this drove up the cost. The profit margins drove up the cost by close to 40% by the time it was getting to the consumer. So really, if there were any cost savings that could have been realized at the factory gate, they had been already absorbed by the supply chain by the time they were getting to the consumers. And then finally, there are issues around the implementation friction. We have issues with HS coding, especially for innovative products, and we'll be hearing from Esther about how that plays out for menstrual cups. We have also administrative issues around claiming of VAT, around the remission process I had mentioned. These are really very complex processes, especially for SMEs, and they forego them altogether because they cannot be able to navigate them, or to navigate the policy. Next slide, please. I think there's a slide that is missing, but we did test the simulation tool on Kenya just to try and see hypothetically how the tax would play out in regards to a reduction in VAT, in terms of a reduction to VAT, and in terms of removing import duty and some para-tariffs. And what we realized is that yes, there was a price reduction that was noted, but it was partial, and only half of the cost savings ended up getting to the consumer. In regards to the market structure, we did realize that the VAT exemption policy, though very well intended, had created some distortions in the market. What we are proposing moving forward is if we could progressively, as Kenya, move from exemptions to zero rating. And then finally, under the implementation friction, we are looking at how we can be able to improve on HS coding, and how we can be able to simplify some of the administrative processes that are around VAT claiming and then the remission and then the duty remission process. And this is a good segue for me to bring in our guest speaker, Davis. Davis will bring to life some of the concepts and the dynamics that Chris and I have spoken about, sort of like just bringing some more light and giving us an industry perspective on the findings. He works very closely with manufacturers and can help us understand how these realities play out in practice every day. I'm delighted to welcome Davis Mwasame from the Kenya Association of Manufacturers. David leads the textile and paper sector in KAM, which includes the menstrual health products. Thank you for joining us today, Davis, and welcome. Davis, you're on and you can hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Maybe to start us off.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. So maybe to start us off, you can begin by giving us the perspective of local manufacturers regarding the existing VAT and import reforms, how those have impacted production cost and competitiveness for them compared to imports. And alongside that, you can let us know whether there are any inputs that still do not qualify for tax exemptions.
Thank you, Rita, and the entire team for convening this meeting. So straight on, for me, I think from a manufacturing perspective, I need to say just on the onset that at least about 70% of our raw materials are imported. Now, those raw materials, as they come into the country, they need to pay various taxes, one of them being import duty, railway development levy, import declaration fees, VAT, and excise duty in some instances. Then the same is converted to an end product, and the end product from Kenya, as rightly said by Rita, is VAT exempt. So we have had a journey with the government. Earlier on, as Rita has explained, there were some classes where we were paying VAT, but government gave us an exemption, and so we are not paying VAT on some of those raw materials. But then it's not an exhaustive process. So you find that the same product that has been classified VAT exemption as a raw material has not been classified to enjoy import duty remission. So depending on which side or the description of the HS code you choose to use, you end up paying either one of them. Now, assuming you pay VAT in that case, you convert the product and get to an end product and you cannot claim that VAT. So what becomes is that you have got a 16% cost above any other competition. So that is what is happening in the country. And knowing that we are at least importing 70%, then you know the magnitude of the impact. And of course, lately, Rita, we have also seen that some of the products actually, like for example, PE film, which is used in sanitary towel manufacturing, will attract a 25% excess duty, which is a sin tax. But for some reason, because of its classification by way of HS code, then it ends up attracting excess duty unintended, and that ends up being a cost to manufacturing. So we have got complexities around that's causing this kind of price inflations. Over to you, Rita.
Thanks, Davis. And maybe as a follow-on to that one, please just describe to us briefly how the duty remission and the VAT recovery process affect local production costs and the day-to-day manufacturing operations.
Thank you. So I'll start with duty remission. So duty remission is a nationally regulated scheme controlled by the government national treasury. So what it does is that the first step is that there has to be, because you operate in a regional community, East African community, the product has to be classified as under the duty remission scheme. Once it's classified, then there is a system which me as a manufacturer will have to register to say that I am a qualified manufacturer of menstrual products and I am supposed to enjoy remission on this particular product. So what happens? That's a period that takes me about another maybe 2 months or 3 months. Once I get that registration and I am admitted as a beneficiary, then I have to order my products. So once you order your products, you have to get your import documents and submit to the national system, where then those import documents are checked and to confirm that actually the product you are importing is qualified under the duty remission scheme and that you have submitted in the right manner. And also to confirm that actually your end product is an approved product, which is menstrual product. So that takes some time. Then once it's imported, you import the product without duty, but you pay a fee. Actually, you pay a fee, which is like a bond to secure the taxes. And then after 12 months after importation, you are supposed to go back to the government and account and say that I imported 100 tons of this product, I have used the whole of it, and so you cancel the bond. And at that point, your funds become free. So when you look at that process itself, I am supposed to tie a particular amount of cash with the government for a period of time. And that means even if I was to lower the price, then in terms of the time value of money, you realize that I am better off to keep my price at par without change. So that's on duty remission. On VAT, now they changed the VAT from VAT zero rate or VATable status to VAT exempt. So when it goes to exempt, what it means is that I cannot claim any VAT. So if I paid 16% on, say, electricity, that is part of my cost. And just to let you know that Kenya has one of the highest cost structure in terms of power. Compared to Egypt, for example, we are paying about 18 cents, dollar cents per kilowatt hour, against maybe 4 in other places. So that VAT on electricity becomes part of the cost of the menstrual product because I cannot claim it. So what we have been advocating for the longest time has been that why don't we then just do one thing? Make the menstrual product zero rated, because when it's zero rated, it means you can claim any taxes that you then pay on the raw material.
Thanks, Davis. We do really appreciate your insights. We are very thankful that you were able to log in and just share those with us. So for the rest of us, Davis will remain with us for the rest of the session. So please feel free to continue engaging with him through the chat and submit any questions you may have. We will answer those as we go along. And this is and for now, I would like to introduce my colleague Tanya, who will give us a perspective from India. Welcome, Tanya.
Thanks, Rita. Just waiting for the slide to come up. As Rita and Davies have shared, the India market structure is a little bit different, and that's why we took Man Global Health team took India as the second country. While Kenya is a fairly import-dependent country market, India has a very strong domestic manufacturing, structure. Going to the first slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So India does have a fairly progressive history of menstrual health reforms in general. So since 2014, going up till very recently, we've had guidelines, policies, budget allocations for menstrual health by central state ministries and departments of health, education, and others. But those have focused primarily on free or subsidized distribution of products, increasing awareness, building menstrual health into education programs, health programs, strengthening wash and disposal infrastructure. But when it comes to tax, the main reform came in 2018. But the context of that, it's important to note, is that in 2017, the country tax structure underwent an overhaul, and a complex structure of domestic, indirect, direct taxes, which were a combination of both centrally implemented and state-level implemented taxes, was replaced by a value-added tax structure called the goods and services tax. So it was considered as, and it is still considered as, a national unified tax system. So within the context of this, in 2018, after advocacy by various stakeholders, GST exempt status was provided to sanitary pads and tampons. And how this is implemented is that the HS code 9619 is allocated, and there are subcodes created at the country level for sanitary pads and tampons for availing this exemption. Next slide, please. And this exemption stays till today. As Rita and Chris had shared, market structure plays a big role in how the tax actually plays down to the consumer level. And India has it looks like there's a fairly competitive structure because we have a large number of brands that are actually now available. We have more than 70 brands that are available on the market. However, it still remains a fairly oligopolistic and highly concentrated market, with the two largest players capturing 82% of the market share. This market share has reduced from about 90% over the last decade, but it's still fairly high. And so India remains a highly concentrated market. It's also dominated by domestic manufacturing, as I shared, as opposed to large degree of imports, as we see in Kenya and other countries. Of the overall pie of the market, 18% is where all of the other players come into picture, which include mostly small and medium enterprises, including multi-product marketeers who are innovating with building menstrual product categories for reusables, white label manufacturers, many of whom are legacy manufacturers, innovators who are coming in with new technologies, R&D on environmentally friendly, compostable, flushable, antimicrobial, and other technologies, and importers and traders. And for this particular set of players, 18%, who have the ability to push the market to being more competitive, there are high cost barriers, and the taxation structures actually made it more difficult. And let's see how. Next slide, please. So here you see the value, basically the value chain of menstrual products for domestic manufacturing. This is pretty much the same as what Rita had shared for domestic manufacturing in Kenya. You have raw materials manufacturing, marketing, distribution, retail, and eventually customers, and GST is levied at every step of the value chain. So GST exempt status means that wherever the final product is being sold from, say, manufacturer to marketer or marketer to retailer, the VAT will be zero. However, under GST, stakeholders are typically able to claim input tax credit, again, something that Davies was also mentioning. And once GST exempt status has been provided, they are unable to claim that input tax credit. So they are ineligible to claim that input tax credit. And for this, so how does this affect many of the players? For the large players that are operating in the market, it gets absorbed across different product categories. For example, they are selling many FMCG products. So say marketing costs and input tax credit that's lost on marketing costs is absorbed across those other categories. But who are most affected is the SMEs, typically single product manufacturers, innovators who are investing in R&D, category building, marketing costs. Those are the ones that are most affected and are unable to claim those costs. Next slide, please. So what this basically means is that lost input tax credit is essentially embedded across the value chain and is passed down to the consumer. So why overall then tax reform has not translated into lower prices in India is again a mix of all the three factors that were shared earlier. The first being policy design, that the GST exemption does not allow stakeholders to actually claim input tax credit. The policy also limits this exemption only to single-use products. So typically the HS code 9619 only includes single-use products. It does include tampons specifically, which is not always the case, but here it does. Sometimes reusable pads are able to be classified within the HS codes and they are can be exempt. However, it's not explicitly called out in the policy, and menstrual cups are definitely not called out. So reusable products remain inconsistently classified within this entire policy design. And this also goes to the implementation frictions of HS codes, where HS codes for reusable products are unclear, as Rita had also mentioned. Market structure plays a big role because market structure is highly concentrated. You have the large players that can absorb costs, but the smaller players who are actually still, not profitable entirely and are investing in market building, investing in innovations, and trying to push the envelope on the competitiveness of the market. They are the ones that face the brunt of these added costs of the unclaimed ITC that gets embedded in the value chain. So this essentially what it does is it raises barriers to entry for any new players, makes it more difficult for them to operate within this structure. There's also a lot of, in terms of implementation, import-export policies that are favorable for SMEs that do exist, but they are unable to claim them because either there's no awareness, limited awareness, or the logistics of it are just too complicated. Again, to the extent that Davis was mentioning is in Kenya, there are similar examples from India, and a lot of these details are included in the report. But there's also additional issues like logistics, especially post-COVID, that have driven up logistics cost, foreign exchange fluctuations, informal costs during the entire operating parts of the supply chain that add to the cost of doing business. And most of these, because again, systems are smaller, not that scaled up, add to the cost of doing business for SMEs prohibitively. And what this means is that the inequitable costs are essentially affecting SMEs more than the larger players and preventing the market from becoming more competitive over time, which would result in lower prices for consumers, and so effectively harming the consumer. Next slide, please. So we also applied the modeling tool. The Man Global Health team has applied the modeling tool to India. And what we see is that if there is a hypothetical shift from GST exemption to the lowest slab of GST, which is 5% currently, it will enable stakeholders to recover input tax credit. And what that would mean is that there can be an estimated 11% price reduction if the ITC is fully recovered. If it's not fully recovered, the estimate still is at 5 to 8% price reduction within this entire market structure. Also, in terms of market impact, this would make it easier for innovators, for SMEs to actually push the envelope within the market, reduce barriers to entry. In terms of affordability, at this point with GST exemption, the lowest income users are spending around 0.93% of their monthly income on menstrual health products, which is clearly above the affordability benchmark. With reforms, it will become more affordable for single-use products to be accessed by consumers, but for the two lowest income quintiles, it will still remain unaffordable. And so even if tax reform does implement this change, products will remain unaffordable for the lowest income groups. And so additional market enabling interventions like targeted subsidies, programs that ensure market expansion at the last mile will still be needed. So that's it in terms of the India case studies. There are more details from our key informant interviews that we did with over 14 stakeholders within the country, in addition to other global interviews that Chris and Rita also conducted. And so there'll be more insights and more details available in the report. But at this point, I'd like to welcome Jaideep Mandal, who's a manufacturer operating in India. He's the founder of Akar Innovations, and they make compostable pads, and they're again operating in that SME category, clearly innovators. So Jaideep, welcome. Thank you for being here with us today. I'd like to pose, two questions to you. The first one basically is that how does this loss of input tax credit that I just spoke about play out for your business? And how does this limit your ability to invest in developing the market for your brand and for your category particularly?
Yeah. Thank you for this opportunity for advocacy and also MHI. Yes, we have been operating as an organization for last 15 years. Out of that, directly into manufacturing for last about 4 years. Before that, we used to set up small mini factories in villages. And now we have come up with our own manufacturing, which is based in Vapi, where I'm right now. So coming to the questions, yes, since this exemptions happened, I think in 2017-18, there have been a lot of challenges we're facing. Like the very first thing happened is that all of our expenses, which primarily starts with the raw materials, which are currently priced between 5% to 18%. Earlier, it was again hovering around 5, 12, and 15, and 18. So all of them are adding up to the cost of the product. That is one thing. Secondly, in our case also, let's say we have to pay a hefty rental of the manufacturing place because we don't own the manufacturing area. All machines are owned by us, but not that rental place, which we pay almost in Indian currency close to 4 lakh rupees of rental. And on top of that, again, the GST, which is 18%. So that adds a lot of cost. That apart from that, also the all kinds of transports. So transports are also GST comes around 18%. So any kind of raw materials input which we get, apart from the paying GST for the raw materials, also the transport cost from wherever it is coming from. So we have to pay this 18%, which is a hefty amount. And same goes for when we send our products to our consumers or to, let's say, B2B players or to the government or anywhere. Again, we had to pay a lot of GST on that. Similarly, there are all kinds of services what we take from anywhere, like it starts with HR consulting to, let's say, CA or audit, or any other services which we take, all of them are at 18% GST, and then we don't get any rate for that. Even if as a good manufacturers, we pay the women who work for us as a daily laborers, for the packaging area. So there we pay for the ESIC and PF, which is the compliance, and we pay for that. But on top of that, again, to the contractor who are giving us this woman who work for us, we have to pay 18% GST on top of this. So actually the women who get paid, let's say per day, 400, 450 rupees on their account, actual cost to us is almost 700 rupees for us, including GST and everything. So all of this are adding up a huge cost. And what has happened is that, like, as I think previously you mentioned also, so when the zero GST or exempted category happened, for a few months, like it looks like the cost has gone down, but actually the cost has gone up by all this GST amount, which is between, let's say, 5 to 18%. And then no company, like especially the large manufacturers, they would sell anything which is without any profit or even negative profit. So the cost actually has gone up for the consumers by 5 to 18% and not less. So it looks like now on the outside that it has gone to zero, but it has actually increased quite a lot. And now also the same, has nothing has changed. Only couple of materials, government have reduced the raw material GST, like from, let's say, the wood pulp, which was earlier about 12%, and now 12% slab was removed. So now it is 5%. And same goes for the non-woven. So the only these two materials which has reduced. Every other materials, it is pretty high. And then it is really hurting us very badly.
Thanks, Jaydeep. So that really sort of, brings into perspective your raw material cost, your labor cost, your manufacturing rental, electricity, as was being mentioned. So all utilities, transport, marketing. You'd also shared in your in your interview that a lot of the marketing cost on online platforms like for Amazon and all of
Yeah,
those
exactly.
costs also input tax credit is inaccessible to you. So that really gets embedded in the value chain. So then, given this, what would be your ask from the government in terms of a policy shift so that you can actually start recovering this ITC or at least, start breaking even on this product line?
I think you mentioned like I think the very basic things government can do is like put it up to the 5% GST, which is I think the bare minimum right now. But even if, let's say, that seems higher for that, even if 1% GST is also taken, then at least we can start recovering the input tax credit. It may take longer time, but that will be helpful. But obviously, I think if we can do 5%, that will be the best, because that would help us to get recovery all this cost. But then, and as you said very rightly, so not only the thing you mentioned, but then the marketing cost, which is huge, and all the platform we use there also, we had to pay all this GST money, which is I think costing us badly. And actually, so the hurting part is that like the consumers are paying for it, like people who cannot afford. We may be the only manufacturer probably in the world who have not changed the basic price of our product, which was 40 rupees for a pack of 8 pads in INR at 8 years back. Still, we are taking the same money for those base product, because it goes for the most people who cannot afford it or who can afford very little amount. But that's hurting us very badly. We don't have any margin. On top of that, we are the first manufacturer, especially in India, or maybe globally, the compostable pad back in 2013. And but we never got any facility from government or otherwise on the tax part, because although we are making something which is sustainable, which otherwise are reducing a lot of environmental cost, or not even, let's say, the carbon things, which has some connections. So things like that, as a sustainable product manufacturers, if there is something on top of that one can get, then we can promote the sustainable products in a better manner rather than what we are able to do now. Right now, our products are priced at least 10 to 15% higher than the other market competitors who are selling plastic pads or other chemical charged pads, which are may not be mostly not friendly for the consumers or even for the environment, while we are making sustainable products, like if we don't get any benefit. So such anything on top of that, if we can get as a sustainable product manufacturers on the raw material side or otherwise, that will be really helpful. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thanks, Jaydeep. So basically, looking at least a bare minimum tax slab, so input tax credit can be claimed.
Yeah.
And secondly, looking at all products holistically, including sustainable products, but also reusable products, would definitely be something that we should ask government for. So with this, thank you, Jaydeep. Thank you for being with us. I will hand the mic back to Chris to take us through some of the advocacy recommendations from this project. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Jaydeep, and thank you, Tanya. Really great perspective. Before we go into recommendations, I wanted to quickly also touch base with Esther Njoroge from Lily Cup, who provided a lot of great insights from her experience in Kenya. She is the CEO of Lily Cup, a product innovator importing the reusable. We wanted to bring Esther. Are you still on? Bring her on just to share her experience as well.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about the challenges of both small and medium-sized enterprises as well as innovators, and that intersects with exactly the world that you live in. So could you share with us your experience of what it was like to navigate HS codes, taxation, and various policy, and the impact that it has on your business as well?
Yeah, so I'll slightly touch on the HS code. So last year I actually pursued importing a second consignment of the menstrual cups. And one of the findings that I was presented by our revenue authority is that menstrual cups are actually classified as beauty products. So they were also, in addition to attracting VAT, they were also attracting excise duty. So furthering the high cost of menstrual product access. However, the extremely biggest challenge to driving growth or even adoption of menstrual cups is the shame as regards talking about menstruation, and this was impacting conversion, especially with the older women. So far, right now, success has been gotten with the younger women below 25. However, the conversion is also being further impacted by accessibility in terms of price. So right now, I'm still at the stage of importing. I'm still importing, and importing comes with its own challenges. I'm a small business, so I'm not able to import high MOQ, high volume. Therefore, there's actually a high cost of the product. So largely, this has actually slowed down. Right now, I'm almost out of stock. I was able to sell some product through a reseller, but because of the price accessibility, conversion has also been hampered. Yeah, so thank you.
Thanks, Esther. I wish you the best of luck there. Very challenging markets. And so really the aim of this work as well is to support policymakers, again, in trying to not just design a favorable policy, but a favorable policy that works for all players, including small and medium-sized enterprises, the innovators that are so important in this market as well. So we're running up on time. And so I want to very quickly, just run through some recommendations. And again, the full report is now on the RHSC website. But if I could just touch on some of the key highlights to make sure that we're landing in time and maybe end up with some time for some Q&A as well. So recommendation number one is make sure that we've talked a lot about tax design and making sure that tax design aligns with market structure. So the recommendations of implementing a 5% GST in India may seem counterintuitive, but it matches the needs of that particular market structure, which is different than in Kenya. If you are a market that is primarily driven by imports, maybe a tax-exempt situation might be more appropriate. So just knowing, ensuring that policy matches the market structure in your country. Aim for tax-neutral treatment, which is aligned to that, and is something that we certainly heard from all of our presenters, our guests today. Ensuring that we enable input VAT recovery to avoid inadvertently sticking or stuck taxes in the product price. Designing policy that fits with tax administrative capacity. It doesn't do any good to design a very complicated and perfect tax policy that the local administration doesn't have the resources to implement and for small businesses to navigate. So that's very important. Sometimes simplicity and imperfect can have a better result than the perfect, very complicated system. Harmonizing classification and HS codes for all MH products. This is something that we've heard throughout the course of this series. There's a lot of great work that's being done on that, but also just clearly opportunities to ensure that policy design matches and aligns with the realities in each one of these country markets. Improving price transparency during change. So a lot of communication. This is something we haven't talked a whole lot about that, but if the government is implementing a price change, the consumer really needs to be informed of that, as well as all of these small players that play an important role in the value chain so that they understand that there has been this change and they can then implement that into their pricing as well. So markets are complex and constrained. So pairing tax reform with targeted market shaping interventions is very important. And finally, just recognizing that even with a very successful policy change, menstrual health products are still going to be out of reach for lowest income individuals. And so ensuring that the lowest income individuals within a country still have access to either subsidized product or a free product through programs that don't distort the entire market, but at the same time ensure that targeted subsidy is available for those that absolutely need it. So that is our work. Thanks everybody for hanging in there. I think we've got, Sarah, a few moments for Q&A. I'm going to try and stop sharing if I can. Okay. Any questions? We have Tanya, Rita are still on the call. They, really understand the situation in India, Kenya specifically, as well as our guest speaker. So if we have any questions there, please feel free to ask. And if not, we're also available as well through email, or you can reach us through Sarah. And again, the materials are now on the website as a resource. Okay, well, I guess our timing worked out quite well, given that our presentations ran slightly long, but I think we were able to communicate our message so well. There's no questions. Oh, I see one from Anne Sizomu.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you so much to India and Kenya for the sharing. It's making me wonder that would it be preemptive, the learning from the countries that have done part of the analysis, and in view of some of the challenges which are like regional, like for example in Uganda and then Kenya, wouldn't it be also further that if we're doing then the analysis for countries that are not yet there in terms of the learning, that it would be good to actually push, because then push for the tax reform that aligning contextually to what will actually lead to effectiveness in terms of the consumers being able to access the products, and also the issue around affordability. Because I find that this is one of sometimes the challenges, and also in some cases, the manufacturers also have informational gaps. Partly it's navigating, especially that here we majorly have local manufacturers, but also at the same time very few. So there's a lot of also imported products. So maybe it would be that within that each country has a case of what sustainably needs to be pushed, and then we we rally around that contextually in a country, because then sometimes when we push for the tax reforms which are general, you find you have a tax reform, but at the same time it has not yielded, and you've spent time on it and then money. So it means that if we're moving forward and going to really push or do advocacy around the tax reform, we should push for those that are actually able to result into issues around the price, not just maybe the enabling environment. That's what I wanted to really add in terms of the reflection.
Yeah, thanks. And just to second that, it's possible and important that prior to pushing for policy reform is to really understand the specific market context. And that's just one of the key takeaways that we've learned here. There's a interactive Excel-based policy simulation tool that's available on the RHSC that can be applied and adapted to your specific country, as well as detailed methodology of how to use the tool. And we'll have a video to walk through the Excel-based tool itself. There are some complicated concepts, and market analysis can be as complicated or as high level as you want it to be, and based on the resources that are available. But I would just really suggest that some fundamental and basic analysis of the existing situation in each one of your countries is important prior to advocating for policy shifts, and then when advocating for policy shifts, making sure that they're going to be neutral across all of the many players in your country.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you to all of our presenters. I think we are at time, so I'm just going to chime in with some quick closing remarks. There's a couple of questions in the chat that we have answered with written responses, but we'll do a final comb through those after the webinar to make sure that we got all of them. So I just wanted to say a tremendous thank you to all of our presenters and speakers today, especially to the Man Global Health team who pulled together this excellent analysis. This also marks the end of this particular webinar series. And so for those who have been with us from the beginning, you'll recall this has been a 4-part webinar series focused on developing equitable menstrual health markets, really thinking about what are critical pathways needed in order to make sure that we're focusing on market development for menstrual health supplies, particularly with this lens of equity in mind. And so we've explored 3 different critical pathways. They're certainly not the only 3, but they are 3 that we think will really advance the development of those menstrual health markets. First, we looked at menstrual health product standards and really dug into the importance of product standards, not only for consumer safety and trust, but also as a critical way to develop a pathway to market development. Second, we looked at the relationship between menstrual health and climate change, thinking both about the way that menstrual health supply chains impact climate change, but also thinking about the way that climate change can impact access to menstrual health supplies and what it would take to develop more climate resilient menstrual health supply chains. And then finally, today, we focused on tax reform and opportunities to improve product affordability, particularly with that equity lens in mind, thinking about how affordability might be different for different income groups and really trying to thread that into work that we do on tax reform. And so all 4 of these webinars will be published on RHSC's website. The first 3 are already up there. And following today's webinar, we will be sending through a final email recap that includes all 4 of the recordings, as well as each of the publications, the different tools, the resources, and the insights from each of these scopes of work. I want to thank everyone who contributed to this work, to our menstrual health supplies workstream. I'm going to drop some links in the chat about that. And of course, to our donors, including the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund, for making this work possible. We will continue to disseminate these out. We'll continue to host meaningful conversations in the workstream on what comes next. And I want to thank each of you for joining. We know this has been a long series, but hopefully it's one that's left you with some helpful reflections and ideas of what comes next for advocacy. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and we will be in touch soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.